But since there are only 3 of you here today, that won't take long. I've introduced myself to all 3 of you before, so I won't repeat that again, but I will say that I'm happy that you're here doing this. I wanted to go over just a few things, but before I start going over some tips and strategies and suggestions, I want to ask what you guys have done. How many people have met with your research librarian? Very good. Good. Did you find that useful?
I did prior to doing this with the graduate music school, so I was introduced to Ian sometime ago.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I really, really encourage you to do that. And I'll be talking as I go through my notes here. I'll be referring to places where they can specifically help. And yesterday when we had a training session and we had some of the practice presentations, there were absolutely a couple of things. One of the presenters, for example, was using a metaphor that he had really developed well, but there were still parts in his presentation where it got a little muddled. And that was a specific point that the research librarians could help with, was working on that metaphor. So I'll be pointing out some things like that. How many people have given your presentation to a friend or a colleague or a pet? Good.
Myself?
Yourself? Okay, do you do it in front of a mirror? Yeah, I can't do that. There are people who say that they can practice by themselves in front of a mirror, but it's just too distracting to me. I just end up saying, is that my best side? No, actually, I think it might be here. But it is a really good idea to practice in front of colleagues and friends, especially people who aren't necessarily in your research area. That's very helpful. How many of you have reviewed your presentations that we emailed you from the first training session? And what'd you think? Did you love it?
I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. But the problem is that I noticed some things that I never knew about myself. Like the way that I talk, pauses, my gestures, the way that I stand there. So it was interesting.
Yeah, it's illuminating, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is.
Who else has comments about theirs? Yes.
Well, the first thing I noticed was how old I was. And then the way my head moved, I go, dude, you have neurological problems. So I couldn't watch the whole thing. I was too embarrassed. I watched about 45 seconds and I said, I need to stand differently and my head doesn't need to twist off like a disjointed Barbie doll or something. I was pretty embarrassed actually.
Anyone else?
I watched it maybe 5 or 7 times, and I think that I noticed everything I knew about myself, because that was not the first time I recorded myself. And I can feel that my mimic is just overwhelming.
Yeah. It's a difficult exercise, but it's very good. And I think that once you have looked at yourself, even a couple of times, it makes it easier for you to calm those hands or to pay attention to that pause. It really does, because you can't, there's no escaping it. There's no glossing over it because you've seen it.
I think that the thing with me is that I've been teaching English to non-native speakers, just beginner levels, so my facial movements are so expressive, like yes, no.
Yeah.
And it becomes part of you.
Yeah, I was teaching an evening class in Idaho, my previous institution, and it was a terrible format because it was a 3-hour long once a week. Well, no one has that kind of attention span. But so I would do exactly what you're talking about. I would be really dramatic and very exaggerating of gesture. And at one point, you know, everyone looked like they were nodding off. And I was teaching microbiology. And so I said to this student on the front row, I said, "Don't you just love this stuff?" And he said, "Well, no, not really." So I never did that again. Okay, and so I want to start off with a couple of reminders, then go into the evaluation criteria with a little bit of specificity, talk a little bit about just some general presentation tips and the slide preparation, and then Dr. Masserini is going to talk about performance anxiety. And then we will do some practices with your material, and those will be timed, and that'll be really a good data point for where you are in the process. So the main reminder, one of them is in the form of a question: how many people know someone who, or have seen someone who it just really seemed like it was impromptu? They could get up in front of a group and just give a wonderful presentation without really putting much effort into it because they just have that gift. Does anyone know that person?
Obama,
Well,
but I don't know.
what I would say is that even when people make it look like nothing's gone into it, something's gone into it. A heck of a lot has gone into it. And so someone asked me one time, they said, well, you know, we noticed that when the speaker at this conference couldn't give their talk, that they just pulled you into it and showed your slides and you just jumped right into it. But it was a slide on my research that I've been doing for 20 years. And so I was very, very familiar with all the different talking points. And so even though I hadn't prepped for that particular talk, I had prepped for years for that talk. So know that to look impromptu, to look extemporaneous, to look like you're not putting effort into it requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of practice.
Sorry to interrupt. Actually the software running it, the drivers need to be updated. So I need to go let the guy who does that know.
Okay.
So we're not gonna be able to get this running.
I think we're going to be okay without slides
Sorry
today.
about this. Okay.
The other thing is simple, unexpected, and interesting. We know that with everyone's creative activity, that you guys have a huge investment in it, and it's a really complicated thing. If your project weren't complicated, it would already be finished, right? So it's very complicated, and you can't capture all that in 3 minutes. And so the idea is to keep, and I'll talk about this when we talk about the slides too, is to keep coming back to simple. It's hard for an academic to do that. In a way, I think we are psychologically invested in the complexity of our disciplines. That's something that draws us to our disciplines. But for a presentation like this, to keep it simple, to have an aspect, an element of the unexpected. And that goes into a point that I'll go more into in a few minutes, and that is the hook. I'm reviewing nominations for the Presidential Fellowship Awards. And one of the professional statements that I was reading started off with the sentence, "I love fish." Well, you know, he goes on to describe his childhood fishing and wanting to dissect fish in high school and wanting to understand how fish work. But that was the opening statement, "I love fish." And, you know, that just made me want to read more. It was simple, and it was interesting, and it was unexpected. Who expects for a PhD nominee to start off with a 3-word sentence, "I love fish"? But it was really a nice hook, and he developed that nicely beyond there. And then the other thing is just the time itself. And if you have practiced, whether with people or with yourself, and timed yourself, what I see in preparation for something like this is that at first it seems like a long time. And if you remember back to when you were doing a kind of extemporaneous presentation on a topic that we just randomly assigned you, many people finished way early. And you had just all this landscape of time left that you didn't use. But as you really start to craft your talk and think about maybe metaphor, think about story, these kinds of concepts, 3 minutes becomes not very much time at all. And so what we typically see is as you get further along in your preparation, that the secret becomes staying under that 3 minutes and not going over too far. In the heats, you'll be docked a certain number of points in your scoring if you go over. Now, the party line is that in the final, if you go over, they just cut you off or they disqualify you. But we, realistically, what we have said last year and what we'll do this year is that you can finish the sentence that you're on. You know, if you call 3 minutes, you at least get to finish, you know, that nugget that was coming out when the time was called. But beyond that, that's right, it would disqualify you. So that 3-minute thing becomes really important.
What if we go under?
You won't be docked going under. You won't be docked going under. And in fact, some of the winning talks haven't used every single second of their time. I mean, let's face it, we can really work to a target, and having someone let you know when you have 1 minute left, when you have 30 seconds left, is very helpful, especially if you've practiced a lot. But it would be very unlikely that everyone would be able to stop speaking right at 3 minutes. So you don't get docked for going under, and you get to finish the phrase or sentence that you're in the middle of when they call time. And I have seen several people who had practiced to the point where when they got called time, they were saying the last thing, and that's perfectly fine. So that's a good segue into some of these other criteria. The criteria with which you'll be judged in the prelims and in the finals fall under 3 different umbrellas, and we have a rubric that we fashion for the judges. One thing you should realize is that we are asking the judges, especially in the final, to go ahead and start their scoring, to go ahead and start their evaluation while you're still speaking. And the reason for that is purely logistic. We don't want to have like an hour-long gap after the presentations before we know the winners. We don't want them to have to take that long to make their decisions. So what we do is we give them a little training session right before they start, where we talk about a way to really distinguish the different talks and to make notes and metrics while they're going on. So in other words, if you see a judge doing this while you're talking, don't think they're ignoring you, but those are their explicit instructions. So the 3 main topics that you'll be judged on are comprehension, impact, and communication. And they are interrelated. But with the comprehension, what we're talking about is being able to clearly communicate and educate your audience, being able to be inclusive and bring them in so that they will feel like they learned something about your discipline. That's one of my favorite things about this whole competition, is that even though I don't have any, for example, applied linguistic training, I have heard some of the 3MRP talks and come out there feeling like I know a little something about applied linguistics. And that's a wonderful thing. That's an empowering thing. So the ability to do that, and the specific things, did you talk so that the audience could really track with you? Did you use appropriate body language to draw in your audience, eye contact? Did your slides enhance the presentation rather than sort of mopping it out? And I'll talk more about that later. And then under the umbrella of impact, did you cover the main points that we need in a presentation like this? Did you clearly tell your audience why what you're doing is important? Why you're doing it? What's the motivation? What is the challenge or problem or knowledge gap that your work is going to help to address, and how will it really address it? And then communication. Are you able to avoid jargon? And everyone's already really working on that. If you have to use a jargon term or an acronym, you need to define it right away. And we've had that in a number of cases where someone feels like there's a term that's really integral. There aren't 50 terms, but there's one. And I really need the audience to understand what this means. And so you say it and then you define it. And one point that I made yesterday was sort of like this dividing line between what you would expect a non-expert lay audience to understand and what you would not expect. And different people probably view that line in different places. And for me, and I'm a biologist, for me the line is this. I assume that everyone who is fairly intelligent and, in 2016 probably knows what DNA is. So I would feel comfortable myself using the term DNA. Now, if I were to have a different opinion and think that I had to technically define that term, I think it would make it worse. I think to say DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, would make that worse. If I did feel like, man, I can't be sure everyone in that audience knows what DNA is, I would probably want to say DNA, which is the genetic material in every living cell. But for me, I would assume that people know what DNA is. But I do not assume that people know what PCR is, polymerase chain reaction, which is a very, very common term in molecular biology. But I have no idea if someone who is a geologist, for example, or a musician would know what polymerase chain reaction is, PCR. So if I use that term, I would want to define it. And I wouldn't define it just as polymerase chain reaction, because again, that doesn't give any more information for someone who's not in the field. I would say it's a technique to amplify specific pieces of DNA. Okay? All right. So with respect to oral communication, just some general tips. The pieces of the 3MR talk have to be identifying the problem, what your research is doing to contribute to solving the problem or addressing the challenge or filling in the knowledge gap, and then really hooking people into why it's significant, why it's important. So one of the tips in thinking about polishing up your presentation is to have something unique in it. I think everyone in here is working on a project that has a unique aspect to it. I mean, you wouldn't be working on it if it weren't unique, right? And so if there's something unique, if there's something very cool about it, if there's something that is, I don't know, a little bit gross, that can be fodder for a talk like this. That can really inform something that people are interested in. A little humor is always a good thing. And I'm not talking about slapstick over the top, but we found in a couple of the presentations yesterday, we found just the place where that would be the point for just a little quip or a little something funny, a little humorous thing. And you know, I pity the person who conducts an entire research project and there's nothing funny about it, right? And sometimes things can be funny that really aren't funny at the time. Like you went down this entire avenue because you were certain that this was the way to go. And then it all just messed up and, you know, it wasted 6 months of your time, which is something you probably shed tears over at the time. But you could turn that into something really funny about a change in direction, sort of the old bait and switch in a talk like this. And that's, again, something that'll really pull people in because everyone's felt that kind of frustration, whether it was with a research project or rearing a child or, you know, who knows what. So, did someone say something? Oh, I'm sorry, just in my head. Okay. Some tips for talking to a non-specialized audience is to use shorter words, to use shorter sentences and shorter paragraphs. I like fish. I love fish. You know, that kind of thing really did make me want to read that student's professional statement. Avoiding jargon. Here's a tip that I particularly like, and that is avoiding passive voice. That's not a requirement, but it's just easier to communicate with a non-specialist audience if you use active voice. And the way that we teach our students in the sciences to understand what passive versus active voice is that if you can add the phrase to the end of it, by zombies, it's passive voice. The Petri dishes were spread by zombies. But if you say, I spread the Petri dishes, by zombies doesn't fit. That's active voice. So if by zombies works, it's passive voice, and if it doesn't work, it's active. And active it's a way to more tightly engage with people, especially if they're not experts in your field. A really, really important tip is to tell a story. And remember, a story has a beginning and a middle and an end. And when I make that circle, that's how I think of a story in this kind of context. I think of starting out with some kind of hook, some kind of why, really communicating to your audience why this is important, why I'm doing this. This has to be done because. And then the meat of it is the middle, where you talk about the method that you used and just briefly what you found. And then tie that loop back up with the end of the story. If you're using an analogy, come back to, or a metaphor, come back to it. Close that loop. And that whole circle then becomes your story. And it's a 3-minute story. Yeah, this is a good one. And I didn't mention this one yesterday, but it's good. And I don't know, you probably are past this, but you might have found it to be true. And that is, and I think this is true of most preparation of papers and presentations, and that is start off with more. Start off going over time, and then chop it back. It's so much easier to start big and chop back than it is to have something that's really, really short and then trying to flesh it out. Because that's when most of us end up putting what is very obvious is filler in a presentation. And so when I have done something and written a script for a presentation and it's come up way short, I just start over. And I really tell a bigger story and then just do the editing down. Okay, any questions? Comments? Then let's talk about the slide preparation. How many people have your slides done, or at least a draft of them? Okay, that's another place where these librarians can really help, especially if you are struggling with a technical concept or a method or even a result, and you're just not sure how to communicate it without getting into the discipline-specific jargon. They can help do that, and they've done an amazing job with presenters in the past. Less is more. So if we were actually showing our slides today, like we had planned on, you'd see the one that is titled now says The Slide. And that's a remnant because for the past 2 years doing this event, we've only allowed one, but as you know, now you can have up to 6. A title slide that's consistent for everyone, and then up to 5 content slides. This was a compromise with the U of A, who we'll be facing off with after our competition. But I would encourage you not to think that you need to have that many. When they told us that they allowed up to 10, I was flabbergasted. I just cannot imagine being in an audience and tracking with what someone's saying if I have to do this Rolodex thing in my head of all these slides. And the other thing about your slide is that most of us doing research or scholarly or creative projects amass a library of amazing images related to what we're working on. And this may or may not be the time to show amazing images because we don't want your slide, however gorgeous it is, to detract from you. You're going to be standing in front of the audience. And for the final, the heats are going to all be in here. The preliminaries will be in here. And so you're familiar with this environment now. But for the final in Ashurst, you're going to be on the floor. So the same level where all the chairs are. And the stage is behind you, and that slide's going to be really big behind you on that stage. And if you have this amazing, beautiful color, wham thing, and you show one after another, no one's going to look at you. And you're where the action is. So people have said, well, how do we dress for this? And the answer to that is no costumes, no props or anything like that. Business casual is the way I like to put it. Looking like you're going for the casual end of a job interview. Yes, we have had some of the guys who have worn suits, but most of them have had on like nice khakis or something and just a shirt. Just dress the way that you would coming into an office. But you don't need to be fancy, and it can't be a costume. The other thing about the slides is there's no animation, and we have to be really careful to describe what that means. In PowerPoint, you can have them fade in, fade out. When you switch slides, we don't allow any of that. If you want to zero in on something on your slide, it can't be embedded in that slide. It needs to be a separate slide. The slides really should not overshadow what you're talking about, what you're saying. I think for many people, especially people who don't have a lot of experience giving presentations, it's sort of like this natural tendency to want to share the attention with your slides, to want to get all that attention off of you, right? Especially if you're feeling a little self-conscious. But resist that temptation and only show material on your slides that is pivotal to understanding your talk. The other thing is that you are not going to have like a laser pointer to go over points A, B, and C on a slide. It's not that kind of a presentation. There are people who, practicing their talk, they plan a gesture like this so the audience knows when it would really be good to get a visual to go with what they're saying. But that's pretty much it. So if you have like 4 or 5 different competing images on one slide, that might be difficult to pull off. You will have the clicker so that you will be able to control your own slides when they appear. One thing that a student did yesterday, and we found it distracting, was, and I understand why she did it, she showed a slide, and then she showed the next slide, and then she was coming back to the point she made on the very first one, so she showed that again. But, you know, John pointed out that for a second he thought that the slides were going in reverse. He thought there might be a hitch. And so it took him away just a little bit from what she was saying. So while her point was fine, and in a regular conference presentation we see that a lot where someone says, and coming back to this, blah, 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 but we just don't have that time in 3 minutes. And it was distracting, so don't do that. I'll reiterate what you've heard about the audio and video clips. We're allowing them this year, but you really, really should not think, oh, I want to put an audio or video clip in mine. It should be a necessity. It should be a really important point to complement what you're saying. The example that I like to use is birds. I'm a biologist, right? So if you're studying birds and you're studying something like the impact they have on insect communities in a particular vegetation type, and you're thinking, oh, they're so beautiful, my study animals, I'm just going to show this video clip of them flying over this beautiful sky. Don't do that. Don't do that. That's not critical. And while it's beautiful, its very beauty will take away the eyes of your audience from what you're saying, and you're going into the insects they might eat and all this stuff, and they're, you know, still thinking about those pretty birds. But if your research is on like interpreting bird vocalizations and tying this into different behaviors, there might be an audio clip that is really important for your audience to hear. And when you play it, you will probably say something like, in this clip, please notice the pause at 3 seconds and at 8 seconds, because it's pivotal to the observation we made. And in that case, the audience is focusing on that, and then you're addressing it right then. And so it really supports and adds to the presentation. It doesn't take away from it. Let's see what other points I want to make about the slide. Oh yeah, this is not an occasion where you do acknowledgments. Okay, and that's very different from a conference presentation too, because we almost always see at a conference presentation someone list thanking everyone in their lab, their spouse, their funding agencies, and all that. Don't do any of that here. Okay, and as I did yesterday, I'll give you just a side tip. When you're doing a conference presentation, show your acknowledgments first, right when you're getting started. It's very distracting for an audience to have, and we see it 1,000 times, right? Everyone does it. They put up their acknowledgments and then they say, do you have any questions? And so the audience is sort of looking to see who all they worked with, did they have an NSF grant, and it detracts them from being able to formulate good questions. So this does not relate to what we're talking about now, but it is a tip that when you're preparing professional presentations, I find it much more polished to go ahead up front and thank the people. And then when you come to your final conclusions and you say, do you have questions, they really are there with you. But there's no place in that for this. Giving special thanks. Oh, and the other thing, and you won't do this, you could potentially if you worked hard at it, but it would be tough. Don't read your slide. In the case of the finals, you would have to basically do this to read that slide. It's not like, if you were in here and you were just glancing back at it. It'll be actually behind you. But resist the temptation, even if you are such a contortionist that you think you can pull that off, because no one likes looking at the back of someone's head while they're reading their slide. Okay, let's see if there's anything else. I have a couple more things, and then I'm going to turn it over to John. I do this, everyone does this. Try to minimize it if you can, and that is the filler ums, ers, us. And the first time I videotaped myself, that's what I was just overwhelmed with. I've really tried to back off on it, and when I think about it, I can minimize it. I can't eliminate it. It's just too much of a verbal tic that I have, and most people do. But if you do look at yourself giving a presentation, that can help, just to minimize it. The other thing is, most of us, when we're speaking in front of someone, whether it's formal or informal or whatever, there's very likely to be a time when we will misspeak, mispronounce a word, say something wrong, or just stutter or cough or something like that. Maybe even lose our place in where we were just momentarily. The main take-home here is not to worry about that. If you looked at the videotapes of our winners, they have done that. Sean Mahoney won last year, and he had a oops moment. It wasn't a big one, but he just sort of did that kind of thing. No one cares. If it's not sprinkled throughout your talk, no one cares. And the other thing is that everyone in that room is rooting for you. Everyone is there to enjoy and appreciate what you have to say, to learn from it, and they want you to do well. And so if you have a moment like that, which, we're humans and we have them, just getting back on track is perfectly fine, and you have not ruined your chances. Just know that everyone is with you, and no one remembers it a minute later, right? Try not to look at the floor, try not to shove your hands in your pockets, try to have a natural kind of stance and body movements. And then one of these tips, and John and I have talked about this one, it says, no sex, religion, or politics. Well, there are a lot of projects on this campus that involve sex, religion, or politics. And so I guess I would rephrase that to say, be careful in those areas. And especially if you're trying to interject some humor into your presentation, think about it like this.